The conference hall buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't every day that industry leaders gathered for an exclusive, invite-only discussion on the future of technology and business. The sleek, minimalist space, bathed in soft, ambient lighting, reflected the power and prestige of those in attendance. Every seat was filled with top executives, venture capitalists, and rising entrepreneurs, all eager to hear from one of the most influential figures in the world, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. Standing at the podium, Cook exuded the confidence of a man who had shaped an empire. His words carried weight, and tonight they were razor sharp. He spoke about the evolution of leadership, the necessity of innovation, and the dangers of outdated mindsets in an ever-changing world. Then, almost as an afterthought, he let out a small chuckle before adding, "Of course, we all know that real success isn't inherited. In this industry, having the right last name won't get you very far, especially if you don't understand the business you claim to represent." The room erupted into knowing laughter. It wasn't just a statement, it was a dismissal, and everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. In the third row, dressed in a simple yet refined suit, sat Barron Trump. At 6'7", he was an imposing figure, but he had learned how to blend into the background. He'd come here tonight as a student, eager to learn from the best, to listen, to observe. But at that moment, he felt something shift inside him. For years, Barron had lived in the shadow of assumptions. People saw the last name and thought they knew him. They assumed privilege meant ignorance, that wealth meant entitlement. He had grown used to it, even learned to ignore it. But something about Cook's words, so casual, so dismissive, ignited something deeper. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled into a fist beneath the table. He could have stayed silent. He could have let it pass like he always did. But tonight was different. Barron Trump pushed his chair back, the sound cutting through the air like a blade. The laughter faded. The murmurs stopped. Every eye in the room turned toward him. And for the first time, Barron Trump decided to speak. Tim Cook stood tall at the podium, effortlessly commanding the attention of the room. The Apple CEO was a man who had seen the rise and fall of countless businesses, who had sat in boardrooms with the most powerful minds of the century. His words weren't just opinions, they were pronouncements. And tonight, he had the full attention of an audience that lived and breathed influence. "Success," he began, his voice smooth yet deliberate, "is not a birthright. It's not something you inherit, nor is it something you can buy. True success comes from innovation, from resilience, from an unshakable understanding of the world you're trying to change." A wave of nods swept through the crowd. Executives exchanged glances of approval. Investors tapped their fingers thoughtfully against their polished conference tables. Everyone in that room knew that Cook wasn't just speaking in generalities. He was setting the stage for something more. Cook's eyes scanned the audience, his tone growing sharper. "There are those who step into the world of business believing their name alone is enough, that the achievements of their predecessors somehow translate to their own qualifications, that the power of a surname can open doors that only intelligence and hard work should unlock." He let the words hang in the air, letting the weight of them sink in before delivering the final blow. But in reality, those people don't last. They aren't leaders. They are placeholders, waiting for real innovators to take their place. A murmur rippled through the room. The unspoken name hung in the air like a specter. Trump. The smirk on Cook's face was barely noticeable, but it was there, a subtle, knowing look, exchanged between the most powerful figures in the industry. He didn't need to say it outright, everyone understood. "Technology doesn't care about legacy," Cook continued. "It doesn't care about privilege. The business world is brutal, and the only ones who survive are the ones who prove they belong." He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "And those who don't?" A pause, a slow, knowing smile. "They become a footnote." The room erupted into quiet chuckles, a few outright laughs. Some leaned back in their seats, satisfied with the brutal honesty of the statement. Others nodded in silent agreement. But in the third row, one man wasn't laughing. Barron Trump sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, his hands resting on the table in front of him. The words were calculated, deliberate, meant to wound without ever needing to name him directly, and they did. For years he had endured whispers, people assuming they knew him before he even spoke. They saw the name, the wealth, the lineage, and thought they had him figured out. But this was different. This wasn't whispered. This was public. This was a challenge. Cook had just drawn a line in the sand. The laughter around him blurred into white noise, the echo of it bouncing off the walls, pressing down on him. He had two choices. He could sit there, let the moment pass like all the others, let them believe what they wanted to believe, or he could make them listen. Barron took a slow breath. Then, with a quiet resolve that sent a ripple through the air, he stood up. The quiet scrape of a chair against the polished floor cut through the murmurs like a blade. The laughter faded. The whispers died. Every eye in the room turned, curiosity flickering into disbelief, as Barron Trump rose to his feet. He didn't move with hesitation. He didn't fidget or glance around for reassurance. He simply stood, tall, poised, silent for a moment that stretched, just long enough to make the air feel heavier. Tim Cook's smirk froze. He hadn't expected a response, especially not from him. Barron's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady, low, controlled, but beneath it was something even the most seasoned executives in the room could recognize. Power. I've spent most of my life, Barron began, watching people assume they know who I am before I've even said a word. The silence in the room deepened. They see my last name and think they've got the whole story figured out. They hear Trump and decide I must be arrogant, entitled, just another legacy kid who's had everything handed to him. He tilted his head slightly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Cook's. And I've learned to let it go. Because, honestly, most of the time it's not worth my breath. A flicker of something crossed Cook's face. Annoyance, amusement, Barron didn't care. But when the CEO of one of the most influential companies in the world stands on a stage and dismisses people like me, not because of our actions, not because of our failures, but because of assumptions, that's when I speak. The weight of his words settled over the audience. No one moved. Barron took a step forward, his presence commanding without effort. You say technology doesn't care about legacy, Mr. Cook. That business only rewards those who prove they belong. He nodded slightly. I agree. A few brows lifted. This wasn't the response they had expected. But let's talk about that for a second. Barron gestured toward the crowd. How many people in this room come from wealth? How many of you had advantages others didn't? Connections, mentors, a name that opened doors before you even knew what to do with them. No one dared answer. The difference, Barron continued, his voice like steel, is that most of you don't have to answer for it every second of your life. You don't walk into a room and have your credibility questioned before you even introduce yourself. You don't have to prove that you deserve to be here before you've even spoken. A shift in the atmosphere. Some executives glanced away, suddenly uncomfortable. Others leaned in, intrigued. I've spent years working, studying, building, learning, because I know that no matter what I achieve, there will always be people who say it's because of my last name. He exhaled, measured. But that doesn't scare me. It motivates me. Because one day, when I build something great, they won't be able to ignore it. Not even you. His gaze locked onto Cook's. A slow, measured silence followed, and then applause. Not polite, not hesitant, genuine, a ripple at first, then a wave. Executives, investors, industry leaders, some of the most powerful people in the world clapping for Barron Trump. And Tim Cook, for the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. For the first time that night, Tim Cook hesitated. He had spoken on countless stages, debated some of the brightest minds in the world, and delivered sharp critiques that left industry leaders speechless. But this was different. Barron Trump stood before him, not flustered, not defensive, but calm and commanding. The air in the room had changed. The quiet that followed his words wasn't just silence, it was weighty, charged with something no one had anticipated. Cook studied the young man carefully. He had expected quiet acceptance, maybe a faint nod of acknowledgement, at most a brief rebuttal before Barron melted back into the background. But instead, he had been met with something much rarer, conviction. The applause still echoed faintly, some in the audience murmuring among themselves, casting curious glances between Barron and the legendary Apple CEO. Finally, Cook cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone slightly. Well, he said, offering a small, almost begrudging smile, I have to admit, That's not the response I expected. A few chuckles from the audience, nervous, unsure. Was he going to double down? Pivot? Recover with a sharp-witted remark? Cook exhaled, folding his hands in front of him. You make a fair point, Barron. That caught the room off guard. Cook wasn't one to concede easily. The truth is, he continued, I don't often get challenged like that, especially not in front of an audience like this. He gestured to the room of executives, investors, and industry powerhouses, all watching with keen interest. But you're right about something important. Bias exists, even in rooms full of the so-called meritocracy. A few heads nodded, some shifted uncomfortably. I've built my career believing that the best rise to the top because of their work, because of what they create, Cook said. And maybe I've underestimated what it means to constantly have to prove yourself before you even begin. He paused, letting his words settle. Maybe I underestimated you. The audience stiffened at that. A direct acknowledgement? For the first time that night, Barron's expression flickered. Just briefly. Not in triumph, not in arrogance, but in something closer to understanding. Cook glanced down at his notes, then back at Barron. But let's not sugarcoat things, he continued, his sharp edge returning just slightly. You say you'll build something great, that one day people won't be able to ignore it? He leaned forward. Then do it. The challenge was still there, but now it carried a different weight. Not dismissal. Respect. Barron met his gaze without flinching. I intend to. The audience felt that moment, the shift from confrontation to something else, something that, in the world of business, mattered more than applause, recognition. Cook gave a small nod, then turned back to the audience. Well, he said, I think we just witnessed something interesting tonight. A murmur of agreement, some smiles, some lingering tension. And one undeniable truth, Barron Trump had left an impression. As the event drew to a close, there was a lingering energy in the air, something unspoken yet powerful. Conversations hummed in quiet clusters, executives whispering, exchanging glances, some still absorbing what had just unfolded on stage. Barron Trump had arrived at this event as an unknown variable, another young face in a room of seasoned leaders. But now, he had their attention. Tim Cook, usually the one to control the narrative, had been forced into a moment of self-reflection, not because he had been outwitted, but because Barron had done something far more difficult. He had made them feel. The applause that had followed his words wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was something deeper, more reluctant in some cases, but genuine all the same. He had spoken with a confidence that demanded to be heard, not as the son of a powerful man, but as someone who had earned his voice. As Barron stepped down from the stage, he felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him, some measured, some intrigued, but not a single one dismissive. A few people reached out as he passed, a handshake here, a quiet nod there. Even those who had laughed earlier now seemed to regard him with something new, respect. Tim Cook remained standing at the podium watching him go. He didn't call after him. He didn't try to reclaim the moment. Instead, he exhaled, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips, not of amusement, but of recognition. Because whether he had meant to or not, Barron Trump had done something that so few ever managed. He had changed the room. Barron Trump's moment on that stage wasn't just about proving a point. It was about something much bigger. It was about breaking perceptions. In today's world, whether in business, politics, or everyday life, people will often judge you before they truly know you. The question is, will you let them define you, or will you define yourself? This moment reminds us of a critical truth. Confidence, preparation, and authenticity matter more than titles. Barron didn't win respect by demanding it. He earned it through substance, not status. The same applies to all of us. Whether you're in a meeting, a job interview, or even just speaking up for what you believe in, how you carry yourself will determine how people listen. So ask yourself, are you showing up as your true self or as what others expect you to be? Do you challenge narratives that don't reflect the full truth? Are you ready to prove people wrong? Not with words alone, but with action. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you handle it? Drop your thoughts in the comments.